Imagine it's January 30th, 1968. It's the Vietnamese New Year, a time of peace and celebration. But as night falls, all hell breaks loose. Explosions rock cities, U.S. bases are under siege, and even the American embassy in Saigon is attacked. This is the Tet Offensive, a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War that changed everything. To understand the Tet Offensive, we first need to set the stage. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War had escalated significantly. The United States had poured in resources, troops, and firepower to support South Vietnam against the communist forces of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, had assured the American public that the U.S. was winning the war. He pointed to rising enemy body counts and claimed the North Vietnamese were on the verge of collapse. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated. The Viet Cong, a guerrilla force operating in South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, were determined to reunify the country under communist rule. For years, they waged a war of attrition, aiming to outlast the U.S. and undermine public support back in America. By late 1967, North Vietnamese leaders, including General Vo Nguyen Giap, developed a bold strategy. They planned a massive, coordinated series of attacks across South Vietnam during the Vietnamese New Year, or Tet. The timing was critical. Tet was traditionally a time of ceasefires, and South Vietnamese and U.S. forces were caught off guard. The offensive had two main objectives: to destabilize South Vietnam's government and military, and to inspire a popular uprising among the South Vietnamese people. But the plan was risky. It required months of preparation, moving troops and supplies under the radar, and relied heavily on the element of surprise. On the night of January 30th, 1968, as celebrations began, the Tet Offensive was unleashed. Over 85,000 communist troops launched simultaneous attacks on more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam. In Saigon, the heart of the offensive, the Viet Cong managed to breach the U.S. Embassy compound. For hours, they fought American troops in the very symbol of U.S. power in Vietnam. Though the attackers were eventually neutralized, the damage was done. The embassy, and by extension the United States, looked vulnerable. Other key targets included Hue, a historic city and cultural center. The Battle of Hue became one of the bloodiest and longest engagements of the Tet Offensive. North Vietnamese forces captured much of the city, including the citadel, and held it for weeks. As the offensive unfolded, chaos erupted across South Vietnam. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces scrambled to respond, but the sheer scale of the attacks overwhelmed them initially. Once the initial shock wore off, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces began to regroup. They launched counterattacks to reclaim lost territory and repel the communist forces. In Hue, American Marines and South Vietnamese troops fought house to house, enduring brutal urban warfare. By the end of February, the city was back under Allied control, but the cost was staggering. Thousands of civilians, soldiers, and Viet Cong fighters were killed. The Tet Offensive resulted in devastating losses for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. Estimates suggest that they suffered over 45,000 killed and tens of thousands more wounded or captured. By contrast, U.S. and South Vietnamese casualties were significantly lower. On paper, this was a clear military victory for the United States and South Vietnam. But in reality, the Tet Offensive wasn't about battlefield victories. It was about perception. In the United States, the Tet Offensive was a public relations disaster. Graphic images of the fighting, especially the attack on the U.S. Embassy, were broadcast on television. For the first time, many Americans began to question the optimistic reports from their leaders. Walter Cronkite, one of the most trusted journalists in America, famously declared that the Vietnam War was likely unwinnable. His words resonated deeply, marking a turning point in public opinion. Protests against the war, already growing before Tet, intensified. The offensive shattered the illusion that the U.S. was in control, even though the communists had suffered devastating losses. It revealed a grim truth. The war was far from over, and victory was not guaranteed. The political consequences of the Tet Offensive were profound. President Lyndon B. Johnson, facing mounting criticism, announced in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election. Johnson also began scaling back U.S. involvement in the war. He halted further troop increases and initiated peace talks with North Vietnam. These moves signaled a shift in U.S. strategy from aggressive military engagement to seeking a way out of the conflict. So, what is the legacy of the Tet Offensive? For North Vietnam, it was a tactical disaster, but a strategic victory. Although they failed to spark a popular uprising or achieve significant territorial gains, they succeeded in turning the tide of public opinion against the war in the United States. For the United States, the Tet Offensive was a wake-up call. It exposed the limits of military power and the importance of public perception in modern warfare. The offensive marked the beginning of the end for U.S. involvement in Vietnam, even though the fighting would continue for several more years. The Tet Offensive offers valuable lessons for understanding war and strategy. It shows the power of psychological warfare and how perception can outweigh actual results. It also underscores the importance of adaptability, both in combat and in public relations. For historians, it remains a subject of intense study and debate. Was it a turning point in the Vietnam War? Absolutely. But it was also a reminder that wars are won not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of people. The Tet Offensive was a moment that defined the Vietnam War, a moment that proved the power of resilience, strategy, and perception. What do you think? Was it a victory, a failure, or something in between? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's defining moments. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the Tet Offensive, check out my other videos on the Vietnam War and pivotal battles in history. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more.